The door slammed open before Ilara Voss could turn the lock, and a gust of cold wind carried the smell of wet earth and something wild into her small cabin. She froze, one hand still on the kettle, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Outside, past the broken porch light, a pair of golden eyes watched her from the tree line, unblinking, patient, hungry for answers she was not ready to give. She had lived in 6 towns in 4 years. She never unpacked more than she needed. She never gave her real last name to landlords. She never let anyone look too closely at the thin white scars that ran along her left arm, hidden now beneath a long sleeve even in the warm months. Ashfall Hollow was supposed to be another quiet stop, a place to rest for a season before moving on again. But the moment she had driven past the old stone sign at the edge of town, something in her chest had tightened, like a key turning in a lock she thought she had thrown away. She backed away from the door and pressed her palm against the wood, willing the eyes outside to disappear. They did not. Instead, a low sound rolled through the trees, not quite a growl, not quite a call, something in between, that made the hair on her arms rise. She had heard that sound before, long ago, in another life, in another forest, before everything she loved had been taken from her in a single terrible night. She grabbed the old iron poker from beside the fireplace, more out of habit than any real belief it would help, and waited. Minutes passed. The eyes blinked once, then vanished into the dark. Only then did she let out the breath she had been holding, sinking down against the door, until she sat on the cold floor, her knees pulled to her chest. In the morning she told herself it had been a deer, or a large dog, or her own tired mind playing tricks after another restless night. She had not slept properly in years, not since the fire, not since the accusations, not since she had run from the only family she had ever truly known. She dressed in plain clothes, tied her dark hair back, and walked into town to buy bread and milk, keeping her eyes low, her steps quick, her smile ready, in case anyone looked at her too long. Ashfall Hollow was smaller than she expected, a cluster of stone buildings around a square, a bakery with steamed-up windows, a hardware store with a bell above the door, and beyond it all, thick forest that seemed to press in from every direction, as if the town existed only because the trees allowed it. People nodded at her politely enough, but there was something careful in the way they watched the newcomer, something guarded, as if they all shared a secret they were not about to share with her. She noticed it in small things, the way shop doors were locked before sunset, even in the middle of summer, the way mothers called their children home earlier than seemed necessary, the way an old man at the bakery glanced toward the mountains every time a cloud passed over the sun, muttering something about the moon before catching himself and smiling stiffly at her instead. By the time she returned to her cabin with a paper bag of groceries pressed against her chest, the sun was already low, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep blue. She quickened her pace, telling herself it was only because of the cold, not because of what she had seen the night before. She was almost at her door when a voice, deep and even, stopped her in her tracks. "You're new." She spun around, nearly dropping the bag. A tall man stood a few feet away, arms crossed, dressed simply in a dark jacket and worn boots, but there was nothing simple about the way he held himself, like a coiled spring, like someone who was always ready to move. His eyes were a striking shade of amber, almost gold, and they studied her, with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet somehow made it impossible to do so. "I just moved in," she said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. "Renting the cabin down the path." "I know," he said simply. "I'm Cade. I run things around here." "Run things?" "Ashfall Hollow is a small town," he said, a faint, unreadable smile touching his lips. "Someone has to keep an eye on it." There was something in the way he said it, something layered beneath the casual words, that told her he was not talking about being the mayor or the sheriff. She thought of the eyes in the dark the night before, golden and unblinking, and a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "I didn't mean to intrude on anyone's land," she said carefully. "The rental agent said the cabin was available." "It is," Cade said. "I'm not here to tell you to leave. I'm here because I like to know who is living at the edge of my town." He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something she could not hear. "You smell like fear." The words hit her like a slap. She stiffened, gripping the grocery bag tighter. "Excuse me?" He seemed to catch himself, some flicker of restraint passing behind his amber eyes. "Forgive me. Strange thing to say to someone you just met. Long night. Didn't sleep well. He offered a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Welcome to Ashfall Hollow, Miss Voss, she said, after a pause just a fraction too long. Ilara Voss. Ilara, he repeated, as if testing the shape of the name in his mouth. Careful walking the woods path after dark. We get wildlife out here. Bigger than most places. I noticed, she said quietly, thinking of the golden eyes. He studied her for one more long moment, as though trying to read something written beneath her skin, then gave a small nod and turned, disappearing down the path toward the trees with the silent, easy grace of someone who had walked that ground 1,000 times before. Ilara stood frozen until his shadow had completely vanished, then hurried the rest of the way to her cabin and locked the door behind her, sliding the old bolt into place with shaking hands. That night, sleep refused to come. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the old wooden house, every whisper of wind through the trees. Around midnight, a long, low howl rose somewhere deep in the forest, joined a moment later by another, and then another, until the night seemed to hum with them, a chorus that was both beautiful and terrifying. She had not heard a sound like that in 4 years, not since the night everything burned. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it did not block out the memory that came crashing back regardless, unbidden and merciless. She had been 17. Her pack had lived hidden in the hills outside a town much like this one, a family bound by more than blood, led by an alpha who had raised her like a daughter after her own parents had died. She remembered running through those same kinds of woods as a child, laughing, free, certain that nothing could ever break the circle of people who loved her. She remembered her wolf, warm and bright inside her chest, a second heartbeat that made her feel whole. Then came the night of the betrayal. Someone from within the pack had opened the gates to enemies who wanted their territory, and by morning half the pack was gone, burned or broken, and the survivors turned their grief into anger, searching for someone to blame. Ilara, young and frightened, and unable to explain why her scent had been found near the enemy's camp days before the attack, and camp she had only visited to warn them off after overhearing a rumor, became that someone. No one had listened. No one had asked why she would have warned an enemy camp about anything. They only saw a young wolf who could not account for her actions on the worst night of their lives. The alpha, the man who had raised her, had looked at her with such disappointment that she had felt something inside her break clean in two. He had not killed her, could not bring himself to, but he had done something almost as terrible. He had called upon an old magic, a curse meant only for the most severe punishments, and stripped her wolf away, sealing it deep inside her where she could never again reach it. Then he had told her to run, and never come back, because if she stayed, others in her grieving, furious pack would not show the same mercy he had. She had run. She had been running ever since. Now, lying in a strange bed in a strange town, listening to wolves she did not know howling in a forest she did not understand, Ilara pressed a hand to her chest, feeling for the familiar hollow ache where her wolf used to live. Nothing answered. Nothing ever did. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because she woke with a start to bright sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and the sound of someone knocking gently on her door. She sat up, disoriented, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, before padding across the cold floor to look through the small window beside the door. It was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with warm brown skin and a mess of curly hair pulled into a loose bun, holding a basket covered with a cloth. "Hi," the woman said brightly, when Ilara opened the door a cautious crack. "I'm Grace. I live just down the road. I heard someone new moved in, and thought I'd bring over some bread, since the bakery in town is fine but nothing beats homemade." She held out the basket with a genuine, easy smile that made Ilara's guard lower just slightly. "That's very kind," Ilara said, taking the basket. "I'm Ilara." "I know," Grace said, then laughed at herself. "Sorry, small town. Word travels fast, especially when Cade Farron himself was seen talking to the new arrival last night." Ilara's stomach tightened. "You know him?" "Everyone knows Cade," Grace said, leaning casually against the doorframe as if this were the most ordinary conversation in the world. "He's sort of the one who keeps everything in order around here. His family always has been. People trust him." She studied Ilara for a moment, her expression softening. "You looked a little pale just now. Did he scare you?" "No," Ilara said quickly. Too quickly. "He was just direct." Grace laughed again, a warm, easy sound. That's Cade for you. He takes his responsibilities seriously. But he's not a bad man, if that's what's worrying you. Ashfall Hollow is safer than most places, precisely because he makes sure of it. Alara wanted to ask what exactly Cade was responsible for. Wanted to ask why the whole town seemed to move to some rhythm she could not quite hear. But she held her tongue, unwilling to reveal how much she already suspected. Instead, she thanked Grace for the bread, and promised to return the basket soon, watching from the window as the young woman walked back down the path, humming softly to herself, entirely unafraid of the woods that pressed close on either side. Later that afternoon, unable to shake her restlessness, Alara decided to explore the edges of the forest near her cabin, telling herself that familiarizing herself with the land would help her feel less like prey and more like someone who belonged, even temporarily. She followed a narrow trail lined with tall pines, the afternoon light slanting gold through the branches, and for a little while, the quiet beauty of the place almost let her forget the tension that had followed her since arriving. Then she heard it. A twig snapping, deliberate, close. She turned sharply, scanning the trees, and found herself once again looking into a pair of amber eyes, though this time, they belonged not to shadows in the dark, but to Cade himself, standing barely 10 feet away, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't walk this far into the woods alone," he said, his voice low. "I didn't realize there were rules about where I could walk," she replied, keeping her chin lifted, even as her pulse raced. "There aren't rules," he said, "just dangers you don't understand yet." "Try me," she said, surprising herself with the boldness in her own voice. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of curiosity replacing the earlier wariness. "You're not like most people who move to a small town looking for quiet," he observed. "Most people who come here are running from something ordinary, a bad marriage, a lost job. You carry yourself like someone running from something else entirely." Ilara's mouth went dry. "You don't know anything about me." "No," he agreed softly. "But I intend to learn." He took a slow step closer, and despite every instinct urging her to run, she found herself rooted in place, caught in the pull of those strange golden eyes. "Whatever you're hiding, Alara Voss, this town has a way of pulling secrets into the light. Especially secrets that smell like grief and old fire." Before she could respond, a distant howl rose again from somewhere deeper in the trees, and Cade's head turned sharply toward the sound, his entire body tensing like a predator sensing a call to duty. Without another word, he turned and moved swiftly into the trees, vanishing as silently as he had appeared, leaving Alara standing alone on the trail, her heart hammering, the scent of pine and smoke suddenly thick in the cool afternoon air, and the unshakable feeling that whatever secret this town held, it was about to collide with the one she had carried for 4 long, lonely years. She did not sleep that night either, not truly. She sat by the window with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the tree line for any flicker of gold, any shift in shadow, until exhaustion finally pulled her under, sometime near dawn. When she woke, the sun was already high, and for a moment, she almost believed the last 2 days had been nothing but a strange dream, brought on by too little sleep and too much memory. Then she caught sight of fresh paw prints, enormous and deliberate, pressed into the soft earth just outside her window, and she knew with certainty that Ashfall Hollow was no ordinary town, and Cade Farron was no ordinary man. She spent the following days trying to settle into some version of a normal life, unpacking the few boxes she had brought, arranging her small kitchen, walking into town each morning for supplies and polite, careful conversation. She learned that Grace worked at the bakery and had lived in Ashfall Hollow her whole life. She learned that the old man who watched the moon so carefully was named Elias, and that he had once been close friends with Cade's father. She learned, mostly through the things people did not say rather than the things they did, that the Farron family had led this town for generations, and that their leadership had something to do with the strange, careful rhythms she had noticed from her very first day. She told herself she was simply gathering information, the way any newcomer might, but the truth was that every fact she collected about Cade Farron felt like another thread pulling her closer to a truth she was not ready to face. She caught herself thinking about his eyes more often than she wanted to admit, about the low, steady sound of his voice, about the strange magnetic pull she had felt standing across from him on that forest trail. It frightened her more than the howls in the night, because at least she understood fear of the unknown. She did not understand this new, unfamiliar warmth that stirred in her chest whenever his name came up in conversation. On the 5th evening since her arrival, a knock came at her door, just as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in deep shades of violet. She opened it cautiously, and found Cade standing there, a folded piece of paper in his hand, his expression carefully neutral. "The rental agent asked me to deliver this," he said, holding out the paper. "Paperwork about the property line, nothing urgent." She took it, aware of how close his fingers came to hers, aware of the warmth radiating from him, even in the cool evening air. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to bring it yourself." "I wanted to check on you," he admitted, surprising her with his honesty. "You've been keeping mostly to yourself." "I like quiet," she said. "So do I," he said, and something in the way he said it made her believe, for the first time since arriving, that perhaps they were not so different after all, two people carrying weights they did not know how to set down. "Ilara," he continued, his voice lower now, careful. "Whatever happened to you, wherever you came from, you don't have to tell me. But I want you to know that this town, whatever else it is, does not turn away people who need shelter. If you ever need to talk, my door is open." She stared at him, unable to find words for the strange ache his kindness stirred in her chest, an ache made of both comfort and terror, because kindness had a way of making people careless, and she could not afford to be careless, not with a secret like hers. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I'll keep that in mind." He held her gaze for a long moment, as though searching for something beneath her carefully composed expression, then nodded once and turned to leave, his tall figure disappearing into the deepening twilight. Ilara closed the door slowly, leaning her forehead against the cool wood, her heart pounding with a confusion of feelings she did not have names for. Outside, somewhere in the darkening woods, a single wolf howled, long and low, and this time, instead of fear, she felt something dangerously close to longing stir in her chest, a whisper of the wild she had lost, calling her home. Nathan Blake had watched the exchange from the shadow of the trees a short distance away, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed with an emotion he did not bother to hide from himself, even if he hid it well from everyone else. As Cade's beta and oldest friend, he had seen the alpha through every difficult season the pack had faced, and he did not like what he was seeing now. There was something about the new woman, something that made his instincts prickle with old, familiar unease, a feeling he had not experienced in exactly 4 years, not since the terrible night his own sister had died, in an attack that had never been fully explained. He waited until Cade had walked far enough down the path before falling into step beside him, his voice low. "You're getting close to her fast." "I'm being careful," Cade said, though there was a rare note of uncertainty in his tone that Nathan rarely heard from his alpha. "Careful people don't deliver paperwork personally at sunset," Nathan said. "What is it about her?" Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening path ahead. "My wolf recognizes something in her," he finally admitted. "Something old, something that feels like grief and fire and running." He paused. "And something else, something that feels, impossibly, like home." Nathan's steps faltered slightly, an old grief tightening around his heart, at words that echoed a warning he had heard once before, long ago, from an elder now long past, about signs that came before great change, both wonderful and terrible. He said nothing more, but he made up his mind, in that quiet moment beneath the darkening trees, to learn everything he could about Ilara Voss, for his alpha's sake, and for the sake of a pack that had already lost too much to secrets they had not seen coming in time. Ilara had not intended to fall asleep in the small armchair by her fireplace, but the events of the past days had worn her down more than she realized, and when she opened her eyes again, the fire had burned low, and the cabin had grown cold. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and it took her a moment to realize what had woken her. A memory, sharp and sudden, had surfaced in her dream, one she had spent years trying to bury. She saw herself again as a girl of 17, running through unfamiliar woods at night, her lungs burning, her wolf howling inside her chest, with a desperation she had never felt before. She had gone to warn the rival camp because she had overheard 2 of her own pack's scouts planning something reckless, something that would have started a war neither side could win, and in her youthful idealism, she had believed she could prevent bloodshed by simply telling the truth to whoever would listen. She had not known, could not have known, that her own scout had been secretly working with the enemy camp all along, feeding them information about pack defenses in exchange for promises of power once the old Alpha fell. When the attack came 2 nights later, and half her pack lay dead or dying by morning, no one had believed her explanation. Her scent near the enemy camp, recorded by more than one nose in the panic and grief of the aftermath, had been enough to condemn her in the eyes of wolves who needed someone, anyone, to blame for their unbearable loss. She remembered the Alpha's face, the man she had called father in every way that mattered, and the terrible sorrow in his eyes as he performed the curse that stripped her wolf away forever, believing even then that he was showing her mercy by letting her live at all, rather than delivering the justice the rest of the pack demanded. She had never learned the name of the real traitor. She had never had the chance to clear her name, because by the time the truth might have surfaced, she was already gone, running through towns and cities far from wolf territory, terrified that any pack she encountered would recognize the scent of an accused traitor and finish what her own pack had started. The memory left her shaking, and she rose from the chair to splash cold water on her face at the small kitchen sink, trying to steady her breathing. It was in that moment, staring at her own reflection in the dark window above the sink, that she noticed a shape moving just beyond the glass, low and swift among the trees. She spun around, heart hammering, and hurried to the front door to check the lock, only to find it already secure. Through the small window beside the door, she caught sight of the shape again, closer now, moving with the fluid grace of something far larger than any dog. She backed away slowly, retreating toward the small hallway that led to her bedroom, when a sudden, sharp knock came at the door, 3 times, urgent and deliberate. "Ilara," came Cade's voice, low and tense, through the door. "Open the door." She hesitated only a second before unlocking the bolt, and Cade slipped inside quickly, closing and locking the door behind him, with a speed that told her something was seriously wrong. His eyes were sharp, alert, scanning the small cabin before settling back on her. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is a rogue in the area," he said. "Not one of mine, not one from any pack I recognize. It has been circling the edge of town for the past hour, and it came close to your cabin twice." "A rogue?" "A wolf without a pack," he explained, his voice low and controlled, though she could see tension coiled tight in his shoulders. "Sometimes dangerous, sometimes just lost, but not something to take chances with, especially this close to your home." "Why would it come near my cabin specifically?" she asked, though even as the words left her mouth, an uncomfortable suspicion began forming in the back of her mind. Cade's gaze sharpened, studying her face carefully. "That is what I intend to find out," he said. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness with the stillness of someone listening with more than just his ears. "Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me." "Wait," she said, catching his sleeve before he could move toward the door. "You cannot go out there alone." Something flickered across his expression, surprise perhaps, or something gentler, at the concern in her voice. "I will not be alone for long," he said. "Nathan and the others will be here within minutes. I called them the moment I caught the scent." He gently but firmly removed her hand from his sleeve, though his fingers lingered against hers a moment longer than necessary. "Stay safe, Ilara." He slipped out into the night, before she could argue further, and she stood frozen by the door, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of her own heart. Minutes passed like hours. She heard, faintly, the sound of low growls somewhere in the trees, followed by a sharp, pained yelp, and then silence that felt far more frightening than any sound could have been. When the knock finally came again, gentle this time, she nearly collapsed with relief at the sight of Cade standing there, a shallow cut along one arm, but otherwise unharmed. Behind him stood 2 others she recognized vaguely from town, a tall, serious man with dark hair she now knew as Nathan, and a shorter woman, with fierce eyes and cropped blonde hair, who introduced herself simply as Vera. "It is gone," Cade said, stepping inside once more. "Chased it well past the northern boundary. It will not be back tonight." "What was it doing here?" Ilara asked, fetching a clean cloth from her small kitchen and pressing it gently against the cut on his arm, before she had fully considered the intimacy of the gesture. Cade's eyes flicked to hers, something unreadable passing behind them. "I do not know yet," he said carefully, "but I intend to find out. Rogues do not usually come this close to settled territory without a reason." Nathan, standing near the door with his arms crossed, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, saying nothing. though Alara caught the way his gaze lingered on her a moment too long, thoughtful and searching. Vera, meanwhile, moved to the window, scanning the tree line with the alert focus of someone used to standing guard. "We should post someone near the cabin tonight," Vera said, "just until we are certain the threat has passed." "I will stay," Nathan offered quickly, before Cade could respond, and something in his tone suggested he wanted the chance to observe Alara more closely, without the complication of his alpha's obvious interest clouding his judgment. Cade hesitated, some quiet reluctance flickering behind his golden eyes, but eventually nodded. "Fine. I will check in at dawn." After Cade and Vera had left, Nathan settled into the chair Alara had been sleeping in earlier, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and watchful. She busied herself making tea, more to have something to do with her hands than out of any real desire for a warm drink, and the silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable until Nathan finally spoke. "You have lived among wolves before," he said, not quite a question. Alara's hands stilled over the kettle. "What makes you think that?" "The way you moved when Cade told you to stay inside," Nathan said, "like someone following pack instruction, not someone confused by a stranger giving orders in their own home." His eyes studied her carefully. "And the way you dressed that cut on his arm, like you have done it before, like you knew exactly how much pressure to use." She said nothing, her throat tight, unable to find a lie convincing enough to offer. "I am not accusing you of anything," Nathan continued, his voice softening slightly. "I lost my sister 4 years ago, in an attack that still does not make sense to me. I have spent a long time since then trying to understand things that happen to packs far from here. I recognize the weight some people carry, Alara. I see it in you." Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, and she set the cup down carefully before sinking into the chair across from him. "If I told you where I came from," she said slowly, "would it change how you looked at me?" "I do not know," Nathan admitted honestly, "but I would rather know the truth and decide for myself than let fear of the unknown decide for me." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of the same suspicion and judgment she had encountered so many times before, and found instead only quiet, patient curiosity. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or the lingering fear from the night's events, or simply the accumulated weight of 4 years spent carrying her secret entirely alone, but something in her finally gave way. "I was born a wolf," she said quietly, "before everything changed." Nathan went very still, his tea forgotten in his hands, and outside, the wind picked up through the trees, carrying with it the distant, mournful echo of a howl that seemed to linger far longer than it should have, as though the forest itself were waiting to hear what she would say next. Nathan did not press her further that night, though the questions burned clearly behind his eyes, and Alara found herself grateful for his restraint, even as she braced for the moment his curiosity would return. She told him only a little more, enough to explain that she had once belonged to a pack far from Ashfall Hollow, that something terrible had happened, and that she had lost her wolf as a result, though she carefully avoided any mention of accusations or betrayal, unwilling to hand him the full weight of her past before she understood what kind of man he truly was. He listened without judgment, asked no more than she offered, and left, just after dawn, with a quiet promise that her secret was safe with him, at least for now. Word did not spread through Ashfall Hollow the way Alara feared it might. Grace still greeted her warmly at the bakery each morning. Elias still nodded politely from his porch as she passed, and life in the small town continued much as it had before, undisturbed by whatever conversation had passed between her and Nathan in the quiet hours before sunrise. Yet she noticed a subtle shift in the way Cade watched her when their paths crossed, a new carefulness in his expression, as though he too had learned something, even if he had not learned it directly from her. Nearly a week passed before he finally addressed it. She had gone to check her mailbox at the edge of the forest path one afternoon, when he appeared beside her as silently as always, falling into step without invitation. "Nathan told me," he said simply, without preamble. Alara's stomach dropped, and she stopped walking, her fingers tightening around the small stack of mail in her hands. "He promised he wouldn't." "He didn't tell me everything," Cade said quickly, holding up a hand as though to ease her rising panic. "Only that you were born a wolf, and that something happened to take it from you. He thought I deserved to know that much, at least, since you're living within my territory." "And what do you think?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Now that you know?" Cade was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "I think," he said slowly, "that whatever happened to you, it left scars deep enough that you still flinch at the sound of a howl. I think you've spent years running from something you didn't deserve to be blamed for. And I think," he added, his voice softening, "that you don't have to keep carrying it alone, if you don't want to." Tears pricked unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to let herself become vulnerable in front of a man whose kindness could so easily become a trap if she let herself trust it too quickly. "You don't know what I did," she said quietly, "what I was accused of." "Then tell me," he said. "Let me decide for myself, the way Nathan did." She hesitated for a long moment, the late afternoon sun slanting gold through the trees around them, and finally, haltingly, she began to speak. She told him about her pack in the hills, about the alpha who had raised her, about the rumor she had overheard, and the reckless decision to warn a rival camp, believing she could prevent a war with nothing more than the truth. She told him about the attack that came 2 nights later, about the accusations that followed, about the curse that stripped her wolf away, and left her running ever since, unable to prove her innocence to anyone who would listen. Cade listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though she noticed his jaw tightening at certain points in her story, a controlled anger simmering just beneath the surface of his composure. When she finished, silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of leaves overhead and the distant call of some forest bird. "They never found the real traitor," he said finally. Not quite a question. "No," Ilara said. "I was gone before anyone could look any further. I don't know if they ever tried." "That's not justice," Cade said, his voice low and hard with a quiet fury she suspected was not directed at her at all. "That's convenience. It's easier to blame someone who's already an easy target than to hunt for someone still hiding among you." "You believe me," she said softly, almost disbelieving. "I believe your wolf would have known," he said. "Wolves do not easily fool their own instincts about loyalty and betrayal. If your pack's alpha had truly believed you capable of such a thing, I doubt he would have shown you the mercy of stripping your wolf, rather than ending your life entirely." Some part of him must have doubted the accusations, even as he yielded to the pack's need for someone to blame. The observation struck something deep within her, a truth she had never quite allowed herself to consider in 4 years of guilt and running. She had always assumed her alpha's mercy was simply weakness, an inability to fully condemn her despite believing the worst. She had never considered that it might have been doubt, instead, a quiet uncertainty he could not voice against the grief and anger of an entire wounded pack. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked, studying his face carefully. "My past, my guilt or innocence. Why do you care?" Cade was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkening tree line before returning to hers, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight and honesty that made her breath catch. "Because my wolf has been restless since the moment you arrived in this town," he admitted. "Restless in a way I haven't felt in years. I've told myself it's simply caution, the natural wariness of an alpha protecting his territory from an unknown element. But it isn't only that, Ilara. There's something else, something I don't fully understand yet, and it terrifies me more than any rogue wolf circling my borders ever could." She stared at him, understanding beginning to dawn, even as she fought against it, unwilling to let herself hope for something she had long ago convinced herself she did not deserve. "What are you saying?" "I don't know yet," he said, though something in his eyes suggested he understood far more than he was willing to voice aloud just yet. "But I intend to find out, and in the meantime, I intend to help you find the truth about what really happened to your pack, if you'll let me." "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked, though the word stranger felt increasingly false on her tongue, given the strange intimacy that had grown between them in so short a time. "Because I don't believe you're guilty," he said simply. "And because this town has taught me that secrets left buried too long have a way of poisoning everything around them. If there's a traitor still walking free somewhere, still capable of the kind of violence that destroyed your pack once before, then finding the truth isn't just about clearing your name. It's about preventing whatever they might do next." The practical wisdom in his words settled something anxious in her chest, giving her fear a direction beyond simple dread, a purpose she had not allowed herself in years. "Where would we even begin?" she asked. "With what you remember," Cade said. "Every detail, no matter how small it seemed at the time. Sometimes the truth hides in details we've convinced ourselves don't matter. Over the following days, Alara found herself sharing more of her past with Cade than she had shared with anyone since fleeing her old pack, recounting details of the attack she had spent years trying to forget, the layout of the old pack's territory, the names of scouts and elders she had once trusted completely. Cade listened carefully to every word, occasionally asking careful questions that helped her remember details she had buried deep, and slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge of the night that had destroyed everything she once loved. She remembered, with Cade's careful prompting, a conversation she had overheard between two scouts just days before the attack, a conversation she had dismissed at the time as simple grumbling about pack leadership, but which now, examined more closely, carried an undertone of something far more calculated. She remembered one scout in particular, a young wolf named Owen who had always seemed slightly too ambitious, slightly too resentful of the Alpha's authority, though she had never given the observation much weight at the time. Owen, Cade repeated thoughtfully, when she mentioned the name. Do you know what happened to him after the attack? I don't know, Alara admitted. I was gone before I could learn anything about who survived and who didn't. Then that's where we start, Cade said. If he's still alive, and if he was truly involved in what happened, he may have left some trail we can follow. Packs talk, even across long distances. Someone will know something. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains surrounding Ashfall Hollow, Alara felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 4 long years of running. The fragile, dangerous beginning of hope, and beside it, unwelcome but undeniable, the growing warmth of feelings for a man whose golden eyes seemed to see straight through every wall she had built to protect herself, and did not turn away from what he found there. The search for Owen began quietly, with Cade reaching out through old connections he had built over years of leading his pack, contacting allies in distant territories who might have crossed paths with wolves from Alara's old pack after its collapse. It was slow, careful work, the kind that could not be rushed without risking exposure to whoever might still wish Alara harm. And so the days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, one built around careful conversations, shared meals at Alara's small cabin, and a growing closeness that neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. It was nearly 2 weeks after that first confession on the forest path, when Ashfall Hollow's uneasy calm was shattered entirely. Alara had gone into town that morning as usual, intending to pick up groceries before another quiet afternoon, when she heard raised voices near the town square, a commotion that drew a small crowd near the old stone fountain at its center. She pushed closer, curiosity overcoming caution, and found Grace standing pale and shaken near the fountain's edge, being comforted by 2 other women, while Elias spoke in low, urgent tones to a cluster of men she recognized as members of Cade's pack. Something in the tension of the gathered crowd made her stomach twist, with dread, even before she understood what had happened. "What's going on?" she asked, catching Grace's arm gently. Grace turned to her, eyes wide with fear. "Someone attacked the northern farms last night," she said, her voice trembling. "Livestock torn apart. Fences broken. Whatever did it was strong, Alara. Stronger than any ordinary wolf. The Hendersons found claw marks taller than their barn door." Alara's blood ran cold. "A rogue?" "Worse," Grace said. "Elias says the tracks don't match any wolf pattern he's ever seen. Says it moves different, hunts different, like something that isn't just hungry, but hunting with purpose." Before Alara could ask anything further, Cade appeared through the crowd, his expression grim and focused, clearly having already assessed the damage himself. His eyes found hers immediately across the small crowd, something unspoken passing between them. A shared understanding that this attack, whatever it truly was, could not be coincidence, given everything they had recently uncovered about her past. He crossed to her side quickly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I need to show you something," he said, away from the crowd. She followed him a short distance from the square, to where his truck sat parked near the edge of the road, and he retrieved from the passenger seat a small evidence bag containing a single, torn scrap of fabric, dark and coarse, clearly ripped from some larger garment. "Found this caught on the broken fence near the Henderson farm," he said quietly, holding it up for her inspection. "It doesn't belong to any of my pack, and it's not the kind of material anyone in Ashfall Hollow typically wears. I think whoever did this wasn't simply a wild animal acting on instinct. I think this was deliberate. A message, perhaps, or a warning. Alara studied the fabric carefully, an uncomfortable memory stirring at the edges of her mind. Something about the weave, the particular dark shade of the material, that felt achingly familiar, despite the years that had passed since she had last seen anything like it. This looks like the kind of cloth my old pack used for their formal ceremonial garments, she said slowly, her voice tight with dawning horror. Only high-ranking members wore anything made from this particular weave. Cade's expression darkened further. Then whoever attacked those farms last night may have some connection to your old pack after all. Owen, Alara whispered, the name escaping her lips almost involuntarily, as pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. If he really was involved in the betrayal all those years ago, and if he's somehow tracked me here. We don't know that for certain yet, Cade said quickly, though the careful control in his voice suggested he was already considering the same terrible possibility. But we can't take chances, not with something powerful enough to leave marks like these. I want you to stay close to town for the next few days. No solitary walks in the woods, no wandering far from the cabin without someone from my pack nearby. You think he's here for me, Alara said, the realization settling over her like a physical weight. I think, Cade said carefully, that if the real traitor from your old pack learned you were still alive, still capable of exposing what really happened that night, they might consider you a loose thread worth eliminating before anyone could unravel the truth. The thought terrified her more than she wanted to admit, not simply for her own safety, but for the safety of the town that had, however cautiously, begun to feel like something close to home. If Owen truly had followed her here, if he truly was capable of the kind of destruction described at the Henderson farm, then her presence in Ashfall Hollow had placed everyone around her in danger, a thought that filled her with a familiar, exhausting guilt. Maybe I should leave, she said quietly, before anyone else gets hurt because of me. No, Cade said immediately, more sharply than she expected, and when she looked up in surprise, she found his golden eyes fierce, with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. Running didn't protect you before, and it won't protect you now. Whoever this is, they need to be stopped, not avoided. And you deserve, finally, to stop paying for a crime you never committed. And if he comes for me here, in your town, she asked, if more farms get attacked, more lives put at risk, then we'll be ready, Cade said firmly. I have a pack capable of protecting this territory, Alara. What we lack right now is information, and you're the only one who might recognize signs the rest of us would miss. Reluctantly, she agreed to stay, though the guilt of potentially endangering the town continued to gnaw at her in the days that followed. True to Cade's warning, she found herself rarely alone, with either Grace, Nathan, or Vera finding some excuse to accompany her on trips into town or short walks near her cabin, a careful, unobtrusive protection that she recognized and appreciated, even as it underscored the seriousness of the threat they now faced. 3 days after the attack on the Henderson farm, a second attack occurred, this time closer to the town itself, striking the edge of Elias's own property under cover of darkness. The old man himself had woken to strange sounds near his chicken coop and had the presence of mind to retreat inside and bolt his doors rather than investigate, a decision that likely saved his life, given the scale of destruction discovered the following morning. Cade called an emergency gathering of his pack that evening, and for the first time, Alara was invited to join, standing at the edge of a circle of serious faces gathered in the town hall, listening, as Cade laid out what they knew and did not know about the threat facing Ashfall Hollow. Whatever this is, it's growing bolder, Cade said grimly, addressing the assembled pack. 2 attacks in under a week, each one closer to the heart of town than the last. I believe this is connected to events from Alara's past, and I believe whoever is responsible may be targeting her specifically, using these attacks to draw her out, or to send a message that she isn't safe anywhere. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, and Alara felt the weight of many eyes turning toward her, though to her surprise, she found more curiosity and concern in those expressions than the suspicion or hostility she had braced herself to face. Grace reached over and squeezed her hand gently, a small gesture of solidarity that meant more than she could easily express. What do you need from us? Nathan asked, stepping forward as Cade's second-in-command. Increased patrols along the northern and eastern boundaries, Cade said. Pairs only, never alone, given the strength this creature has already demonstrated. And I want eyes on Alara's cabin at all times, until we understand exactly what we're dealing with." The meeting continued late into the evening, plans forming and reforming as different pack members offered insights and concerns, and by the time Elara finally returned to her cabin, escorted carefully by Cade himself, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, though sleep still felt impossibly distant given the fear coiling tight in her chest. "Try to rest," Cade said gently, lingering at her door longer than strictly necessary. "Vera will be watching the perimeter tonight. You're safe for now." "For now," Elara repeated softly, unable to keep the weariness from her voice. "I'm so tired of only ever being safe for now, Cade. I want to actually be safe. I want this to actually be over." Something fierce and protective flashed behind his amber eyes, and before she quite understood what was happening, he had closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to gently cup her face, tilting it up toward his own. "It will be," he said quietly, with a certainty that startled her. "I promise you, Elara, whatever it takes, I will make sure this ends, and that you finally get to stop running." For a long moment, neither of them moved, caught in a charged stillness that felt like the edge of something neither of them had quite dared to name, until finally, gently, Cade pressed a soft kiss to her forehead and stepped back, leaving her breathless and shaken in entirely new and unfamiliar ways, as he disappeared into the darkness to continue his watch over the town he had sworn to protect. In the days that followed, Cade's search for information about Owen finally yielded results, though not the kind anyone had hoped for. An old contact from a distant northern territory, a pack elder named Felix who had maintained loose ties with several packs over the decades, sent word confirming that a wolf matching Owen's description had indeed survived the attack on Elara's old pack years ago, and had subsequently vanished from any known pack territory shortly afterward, resurfacing occasionally in rumors as a dangerous rogue operating alone, always just ahead of anyone attempting to track him down. "He's been moving between territories for years," Cade explained to Elara one evening, spreading a rough hand-drawn map across her kitchen table, marked with locations where Owen had reportedly been sighted, never staying long enough to be caught, never causing enough damage in any single place to draw serious, coordinated pursuit. Until now. "Why now?" Elara asked, studying the map with a growing sense of dread. "Why come after me after all these years, when he's clearly been careful to avoid exactly this kind of attention?" "I don't know," Cade admitted, "unless something changed recently. Unless he learned something that made you a more immediate threat than simply an old accusation he'd successfully pinned on someone else." The realization struck them both at nearly the same moment, and Elara felt the blood drain from her face as she considered the implications. "Grace," she said suddenly. "A few weeks ago, before any of this started, I mentioned to Grace that I used to live somewhere in the Northern Territories, before quickly changing the subject. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but if word of that conversation somehow spread, if it reached the wrong ears—" "It's possible," Cade said grimly. "Small towns talk, even ones as careful with secrets as this one. If Owen has contacts anywhere near here, even distant, tenuous ones, word of a woman with your particular history settling in Ashfall Hollow could have reached him quickly enough to explain his sudden appearance." The thought that her own careless words might have drawn this danger to the town filled Elara with fresh guilt, though Cade was quick to reassure her that the responsibility for any violence lay entirely with whoever chose to commit it, not with an innocent conversation shared in a moment of forgotten caution. Still, the knowledge that Owen was likely close, likely watching, added a new layer of tension to every quiet moment in the days that followed. The pack's patrols continued without incident for nearly a week, long enough that some began to hope the threat had perhaps moved on, deterred by the increased vigilance around Ashfall Hollow's borders. Elara did not share this hope. Something in her instincts, dulled as they were by years without her wolf, still recognized the particular quality of danger that lingered just out of sight, patient and calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came on a moonless night, nearly 10 days after the attack on Elias's property, when a scream shattered the quiet of the town square just after midnight. Elara, who had been unable to sleep and was sitting by her window watching the tree line as she so often did now, saw distant figures moving with alarming speed toward the center of town, and without pausing to consider her own safety, she grabbed a coat and hurried out into the night, following the commotion. By the time she reached the square, a chaotic scene had already unfolded. Vera lay on the ground, bleeding from deep gashes along her side, while Nathan and two other pack members fought desperately against a massive, shadowy shape that moved with unnatural speed and strength. Far larger than any ordinary wolf Ilara had ever encountered. The creature's eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, entirely unlike the warm amber she had come to associate with Cade and his pack, and even from a distance, she could sense something deeply wrong about its presence, something twisted and unnatural. "Owen," she breathed, recognizing something in the creature's movements despite the years and the monstrous transformation that had clearly taken hold of him, whether through dark magic or simple, festering hatred that had warped him beyond anything resembling the ambitious young scout she had once known. Cade arrived moments later, shifting mid-stride into his wolf form, with a speed and power that took Ilara's breath away, even amid the terror of the moment. A massive dark gray wolf that moved to intercept the creature with fierce, protective fury. The battle that followed was brutal and swift, Cade's pack fighting with coordinated precision against an opponent whose raw strength nearly matched their combined efforts. And Ilara watched, helpless and terrified, as claws and teeth flashed in the dim light of the square's old lampposts. It was during a brief lull in the fighting, as Owen's monstrous form retreated momentarily to circle for another attack, that Ilara caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Deep in the shadows near the fountain's edge, another figure stood watching the battle unfold, not participating, simply observing with cold, calculating interest, and something in the way that figure held itself, something painfully familiar, sent a jolt of recognition through her that had nothing to do with old memories of her lost pack. She had seen that same posture, that same careful, watchful stillness, somewhere else entirely, somewhere far more recent than her distant past. Before she could process the implications of what she was seeing, Owen lunged again, this time directly toward her, rather than the pack members fighting to contain him, his glowing yellow eyes fixed with sudden, terrible focus on her alone. Cade's wolf intercepted the charge just in time, tackling the massive creature aside with a force that sent both of them crashing into the old stone fountain, shattering it into pieces. "Run, Ilara," Nathan shouted, blood streaming from a wound along his shoulder, as he moved to help Cade regain his footing against Owen's continued assault. But Ilara found herself frozen, not from fear alone, but from a sudden, overwhelming surge of something she had not felt in 4 long years. A warmth blooming deep in her chest, a second heartbeat stirring beneath her own, as though her long-dormant wolf had suddenly, impossibly, begun to wake at the sight of Cade fighting for his life to protect her. The sensation was disorienting, painful even, like something long asleep forcing its way back to the surface after years of enforced silence, and she gasped, clutching at her chest as an old, familiar warmth spread through her limbs, a warmth she had convinced herself she would never feel again. Owen, sensing perhaps some shift in the air, some change in her scent, turned his glowing eyes toward her once more, breaking free momentarily from Cade's grip to advance on her position with terrifying speed. Ilara's instincts, sharper now than they had been in years, screamed at her to move, to fight, to do something beyond simply standing frozen in fear. And for the first time since that terrible night so long ago, she felt something other than helplessness rising within her, something fierce and protective and entirely her own. She did not know, in that desperate moment, whether her wolf would truly answer her call after so many years of silence, but as Owen's massive form bore down on her, jaws open in a snarl of pure, twisted malice, she found herself moving anyway, driven by instinct rather than conscious thought, ready to fight for her life and for the town that had, against all her expectations, become something worth fighting for. Time seemed to slow as Owen's massive form closed the distance between them, and Ilara's mind raced through 4 years of buried instinct, searching desperately for the wolf she had been forced to abandon. She felt it stir again, faint and uncertain, like an ember struggling to catch flame after being smothered for far too long, but it did not answer fully, not yet, leaving her only with sharpened human reflexes and a fierce, desperate will to survive. She dove aside at the last possible moment, feeling the rush of air as Owen's claws swept through the space she had occupied a heartbeat before, and rolled to her feet in time to see Cade's wolf form slam into the creature's flank with tremendous force, driving him away from her and back toward the center of the square. The two massive wolves grappled fiercely, a blur of teeth and claws and raw, primal strength, and Ilara watched in terrified fascination as Cade fought with a ferocity that spoke of pure protective instinct, every movement aimed at driving the threat away from her, rather than simply winning the fight. Nathan and the others, wounded but still capable, converged on the battle to support their alpha, and slowly, gradually, the tide began to turn against Owen, whose earlier confidence gave way to something more desperate, as he realized he was now outnumbered and outmatched. With a final, furious snarl, the twisted creature broke away from the fight entirely, retreating with unnatural speed into the darkness beyond the square, leaving behind only silence and the heavy panting of exhausted, wounded wolves. Cade shifted back to his human form almost immediately, rushing to Alara's side with obvious concern etched across his face, despite the blood and exhaustion evident in his own posture. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, hands moving to check her for injuries she did not have. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice trembled with the aftershock of adrenaline and the strange, unfamiliar stirring still echoing faintly in her chest. "Cade, I saw someone, watching from the shadows near the fountain. Not fighting, just watching." His expression sharpened immediately. "Did you recognize them?" "I'm not certain," she admitted, frustration coloring her voice. Something about the way they stood felt familiar, but it happened too fast, and then Owen attacked, and I lost sight of them entirely. Cade turned to survey the damaged square, now filled with pack members tending to Vera's injuries and assessing the destruction left by the battle, and something troubled passed behind his eyes as he considered this new piece of information. If there's someone else involved, someone directing Owen or working alongside him, then this threat is more organized than we initially believed, he said grimly. We need to increase our vigilance, and we need to figure out who that watcher might have been. In the days that followed, the town remained on high alert, patrols increased further, and a heavy, anxious tension settled over Ashfall Hollow that even Grace's usual cheerfulness could not fully dispel. Alara found herself drawn increasingly into the daily workings of Cade's pack, offering what insight she could about Owen's likely tactics and motivations, and in the process, she found her earlier fears about being rejected by this community slowly giving way to something she had not expected: genuine acceptance. It was during this tense period that Alara began noticing small, undeniable changes within herself. The faint warmth she had felt during the battle in the square did not fully fade as she expected it might, but instead lingered at the edges of her awareness, growing subtly stronger with each passing day, as though her long-dormant wolf had been permanently shaken from its enforced slumber and was now slowly, painstakingly working its way back toward the surface. She mentioned this to Cade one quiet evening, as they sat together on her small porch, watching the last light of sunset fade behind the mountains. I don't understand it, she said softly. The curse was supposed to be permanent. My old alpha made that very clear when he cast it. There shouldn't be any way for my wolf to return. Cade considered this thoughtfully, his expression contemplative in the dim evening light. Curses tied to strong emotion often have loopholes their creators never intended, he said slowly. If your alpha cast that curse out of grief and doubt rather than pure conviction of your guilt, perhaps some part of the magic itself carried that same uncertainty, leaving space for the bond to eventually heal, if the right circumstances arose. What circumstances? She asked, though something in his careful tone suggested he already suspected an answer he was reluctant to voice. Fated bonds are powerful things, he said quietly, turning to meet her gaze directly. Sometimes powerful enough to break even the strongest curses, if the wolf recognizes something worth waking for. The implication hung heavy in the air between them, and Alara felt her breath catch as she considered what he was suggesting. Cade, she began, uncertain how to voice the question forming in her mind. My wolf recognized you the very first night you arrived in this town, he said, before she could find the words herself. I've spent weeks trying to convince myself it was simply curiosity, or caution, or even sympathy for someone clearly running from old pain. But it's more than that, Alara. I believe you're my fated mate, and I believe that bond, even hidden beneath your curse, may be exactly what's calling your wolf back to the surface now. The words settled over her like both a blessing and a burden, filling her with a warmth she had not allowed herself to feel in years, tangled inextricably with fear of what such a bond might mean, particularly with danger still circling the edges of her new life. If that's true, she said slowly, doesn't that make me even more of a target? If Owen or whoever is working with him learns that I'm your mate, wouldn't that give them even more reason to see me eliminated? Perhaps, Cade admitted. But it also means you're not facing this fight alone anymore, not in any sense. Whatever happens next, we face it together. She studied his face in the fading light, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and found instead only quiet, unwavering certainty. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers close around hers, with a gentleness that belied the fierce protector she had watched fight so ferociously only days before. Together, she repeated softly, testing the shape of the word, a word she had not dared to hope for in 4 long years of solitary running. For the first time since fleeing her old pack, the word did not feel like a lie or an impossible dream, but like the beginning of something real, something worth fighting to protect, no matter what dangers still lingered in the shadows beyond her door. The revelation of their bond did not ease the danger surrounding them, but it did give Alara a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to finally confront the past that had haunted her for so long, rather than continuing to run from it. Together with Cade, she began piecing together everything they knew about Owen and the mysterious watcher she had glimpsed during the battle in the square, searching for any connection that might reveal who was truly orchestrating the danger threatening Ashfall Hollow. It was Grace, unexpectedly, who provided the breakthrough they needed. She approached Alara one afternoon at the bakery, her expression troubled, and asked to speak privately once the shop had emptied of customers. "I overheard something strange yesterday," Grace said carefully, once they were alone. "A man came into town, asking questions about a woman matching your description. He said he was looking for an old friend, but something about the way he asked felt wrong. Cold. Calculated." Alara's heart raced. What did he look like? Grace described a tall man with sharp features and unusually pale eyes, dressed in expensive clothing that seemed out of place in a small town like Ashfall Hollow. The description meant nothing to Alara directly, but when she relayed it to Cade later that evening, his expression darkened considerably. "That sounds like Damon Ashworth," he said grimly. "A wolf from a powerful territory to the east, known for collecting favors and information, rather than fighting his own battles directly. If he's involved somehow, then whatever is happening here goes beyond a simple grudge from your past, Alara. It suggests someone with real resources and influence is backing Owen's efforts. Why would someone like that care about clearing up an old accusation from a pack that no longer even exists?" Alara asked, bewildered. "Perhaps it isn't about the old accusation at all," Cade said slowly, working through the implications aloud. "Perhaps it's about you specifically now, as my fated mate. If Damon Ashworth has ambitions toward expanding his own territory or influence, eliminating potential alliances or bonds that might strengthen a rival pack, like mine, would serve his interests considerably." The theory sent a chill through Alara, the realization that she might have become a target, not merely because of old history, but because of the very bond that had begun to give her life new meaning and purpose. "Then stopping Owen alone won't be enough," she said. "Not if there's someone more powerful directing him from behind the scenes." Cade nodded grimly, already turning his mind toward strategy. "We need proof of Ashworth's involvement, something concrete enough to bring before the Regional Council of Alpha leaders. If he's manipulating events to weaken rival packs through underhanded means, exposing that publicly would cost him far more than any advantage he hopes to gain here." Gathering such proof, however, proved far more dangerous than either of them anticipated. 2 nights later, while Cade and several pack members conducted a careful reconnaissance mission toward the Eastern Territory border, where Ashworth's influence was known to extend, Alara remained at the cabin, with Nathan standing guard, restless and anxious with worry for Cade's safety. It was well past midnight when Nathan suddenly stiffened, his head snapping toward the tree line with an alertness that immediately put Alara on edge. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. "I smell blood, not ours." Before either of them could investigate further, a figure staggered out of the darkness toward the cabin, and Alara's heart lurched with fear as she recognized Vera, still healing from her earlier injuries, now bleeding freshly from a wound along her leg, her expression urgent despite her obvious pain. "Ambush!" Vera gasped, collapsing against the porch railing as Nathan rushed to support her. Near the eastern ridge, Cade and the others walked into a trap. Owen wasn't alone this time. There were at least 3 others with him, and something else, something bigger. Alara's blood ran cold. "Is Cade?" "Alive when I left, but badly outnumbered," Vera said, wincing as Nathan examined her wound. I couldn't reach them in time to help further. I barely escaped myself. Without a second thought, Alara moved toward the door, determination overriding every instinct toward caution. "Show me where," she said firmly. "You can't go out there," Nathan protested. "You don't even have your wolf back, not fully. It's too dangerous." "Cade needs help, and every second we waste arguing is a second he doesn't have," Alara said fiercely, already grabbing a coat and the old iron poker that had once felt so inadequate against the dangers of this world, but which now felt like the only weapon available to her. "I won't sit here and do nothing while the people I care about fight for their lives." Nathan studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks, before finally nodding with grim resolve. "Fine, but we move carefully, and we call for reinforcements the moment we're close enough to assess the situation." They moved swiftly through the dark forest, guided by Vera's directions and Nathan's keen senses, and as they approached the eastern ridge, the sounds of battle grew steadily louder, snarls and impacts, and the occasional pained cry echoing through the trees ahead. Alara's chest tightened with fear as she caught sight of the scene unfolding in a small clearing. Cade and 2 remaining pack members fighting desperately against Owen's monstrous form, and 3 additional wolves she did not recognize, while a 4th figure stood at the clearing's edge, watching with the same cold, calculating stillness she had glimpsed once before near the fountain. Damon Ashworth, she realized immediately, recognizing the tall, sharp-featured man exactly as Grace had described him, his pale eyes reflecting the moonlight with an unsettling gleam as he observed the battle with detached, almost clinical interest, clearly content to let others fight his battles while he assessed the results from a comfortable distance. Nathan immediately moved to join the fight, shifting into his wolf form with a speed born of urgent necessity, and Alara found herself once again frozen at the edge of the clearing, watching the battle rage before her, that same faint warmth stirring deep in her chest, as fear for Cade's safety overwhelmed every other instinct. This time, however, the warmth did not simply flicker and fade. This time, as she watched Cade stumble under the combined assault of Owen and the strange wolves, blood staining his fur dark in the moonlight, something within her finally broke free entirely, a surge of fierce, protective power flooding through her veins with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs and brought her crashing to her knees in the underbrush. Her vision blurred, her bones ached with a transformation she had not experienced in 4 long years, and through the haze of pain and disorientation, she felt her body shifting, changing, reclaiming a shape she had believed lost to her forever. When her vision cleared moments later, she found herself looking at the battle not through human eyes, but through the sharp, familiar senses of her own long-lost wolf, finally, impossibly, returned to her at the exact moment Cade needed her most. The world felt different through her wolf's senses, sharper and more vivid than anything she had experienced in the long years of her human exile, every scent and sound arriving with startling clarity. She caught the acrid smell of blood and fear, the sharp tang of Owen's twisted, unnatural presence, and beneath it all, the familiar warm scent of Cade, now tinged with pain and exhaustion as he fought to hold his ground against overwhelming odds. Alara did not pause to marvel at her transformation. Instinct took over entirely, 4 years of suppressed wolf nature surging forward all at once, and she launched herself into the clearing with a speed and ferocity that startled even Owen's monstrous form, catching him off guard as she drove her weight into his flank, knocking him away from Cade, with a force she had not known she still possessed. The battle that followed passed in a blur of motion and instinct, Alara fighting alongside Cade and his pack, with a coordination that felt both entirely new and strangely, deeply familiar, as though her body remembered truths her conscious mind had long forgotten. Nathan and the other pack members pressed their advantage against the strange, unfamiliar wolves fighting alongside Owen, while Alara focused her efforts on the twisted creature himself, driven by a fierce need to finally end the threat that had haunted her for so many years. Owen fought with a desperate, cornered ferocity, his glowing yellow eyes reflecting something beyond simple malice, something closer to genuine terror as he realized the tide of battle was turning decisively against him. In a final, reckless lunge, he attempted to break past Alara toward the tree line, perhaps hoping to escape entirely, but she anticipated the movement. Years of instinct finally awakened, guiding her actions with unexpected precision, and she intercepted him cleanly, pinning him to the forest floor with a controlled strength that surprised even herself. "Enough," Cade's voice rang out, shifted back into human form now, standing over the pinned creature with fierce authority, despite the visible wounds marking his body. "It's over, Owen. Whatever Ashworth promised you, it wasn't worth this." At the mention of his name, Damon Ashworth, who had remained at the clearing's edge throughout the battle, finally stepped forward, his expression calm and unbothered, despite the clear defeat of his forces. "How disappointing," he said coolly, his pale eyes sweeping across the scene with detached amusement. "I had hoped Owen's particular curse-driven strength would prove more useful than this." "Curse-driven," Ilara repeated, shifting back to her human form now that the immediate threat had been contained, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. "You did this to him. You're the one who twisted him into this creature." "I merely offered him power he was too weak to refuse," Ashworth said with an indifferent shrug. "Owen came to me years ago, desperate and bitter, after being cast out by the remnants of your old pack for reasons he refused to fully explain. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. A useful tool, shaped to serve my interests, in exchange for the strength he so desperately craved." "Why?" Cade demanded, his voice hard with barely controlled anger. "Why target Ilara? Why target my pack?" "Nothing personal," Ashworth said smoothly. "Simply strategy. A weakened rival pack, distracted by old ghosts and internal secrets, is far easier to eventually absorb into my own growing territory than one operating at full strength and unity. Your bond with this woman only made the opportunity more appealing, a chance to eliminate two potential threats with a single, carefully orchestrated effort." The casual cruelty in his explanation filled Ilara with a cold fury, unlike anything she had felt before, and she felt her wolf stir again beneath her skin, ready to answer this fresh threat with the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her through the battle moments before. But Cade moved first, his expression carved from granite. "You've made a critical mistake tonight, Ashworth," he said coldly. "Attacking my territory, harming my pack members. This isn't simply a private grudge anymore. This is a direct violation of regional peace agreements between packs, witnessed now by enough parties to bring before the full council." For the first time, a flicker of genuine concern crossed Ashworth's composed features. "The council rarely concerns itself with disputes between minor territories," he said, though his confidence had visibly cooled. "They will, when presented with clear evidence of unprovoked aggression, curse manipulation, and attempted murder," Cade said firmly. "And they will, when they learn that the original accusation against Ilara Voss, the one that destroyed her old pack and stripped her of her wolf for 4 undeserved years, was built on a foundation of lies, orchestrated by the very man now standing before us." Owen, still pinned beneath the combined authority of Cade's pack, made a low, broken sound, something between a growl and a sob, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the twisted malice that had defined the creature moments before, only the exhausted despair of a man who had lost himself entirely to bitterness and manipulation. "It's true," he said quietly. "I was the one who betrayed the pack. I fed information to the rival camp, wanting power I felt I deserved and had been denied. Ilara never did anything wrong. She only tried to prevent bloodshed, and I let her take the blame for my own crimes, because it was convenient, because I was too cowardly to face the consequences of what I had done." The confession, spoken freely before witnesses from Cade's pack, was exactly the proof they needed, and Ilara felt something long buried within her finally begin to unknot at hearing the truth spoken aloud, after 4 years of carrying guilt that had never truly belonged to her. Tears blurred her vision, relief and grief tangling together in equal measure. Grief for the years lost to running, relief that the truth had finally, impossibly, come to light. Ashworth, sensing the shifting balance of the confrontation and clearly unwilling to face the consequences of his own exposed manipulation, attempted to retreat swiftly into the darkness, but Nathan and 2 other pack members moved quickly to intercept him, restraining him with the same efficient coordination that had characterized the entire battle. "The council will want to hear from you directly," Cade said coldly, addressing the now thoroughly cornered Ashworth, "about Owen's curse, about your involvement in tonight's attack, and about whatever other schemes you've been orchestrating against neighboring territories." As dawn began to break over the eastern ridge, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, the exhausted but victorious group made their way back toward Ashfall Hollow, bringing with them both Owen, finally freed from the worst of his twisted curse, now that Ashworth's dark magic had been broken alongside his defeat, and Ashworth himself, bound and silent, awaiting judgment from a council that would finally hear the full truth of his manipulations. Alara walked beside Cade in comfortable, exhausted silence, her wolf finally settled and present within her chest, after 4 long years of aching absence. And though the road ahead still held challenges, council hearings and formal clearings of her name still to come, she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember something close to genuine peace, walking not away from danger, but toward a future she had finally, truly earned the right to claim. The weeks that followed brought changes to Ashfall Hollow that Alara could scarcely have imagined during those first fearful nights after her arrival. The regional council, upon hearing testimony from Cade, Nathan, Vera, and even a remorseful Owen himself, formally cleared Alara's name of the accusations that had haunted her for 4 long years, declaring the original judgment against her void, and acknowledging the grave injustice she had suffered at the hands of both Owen's original betrayal and her old pack's hasty condemnation. Damon Ashworth faced far harsher consequences, stripped of his territory and authority by the council, for his blatant violations of regional peace agreements and his cruel manipulation of Owen's curse for personal gain. Owen himself, freed from the darkest aspects of his twisted transformation once Ashworth's magic had been broken, faced a lengthy period of council-supervised atonement, a path that would take years to walk, but which at least offered him the chance to eventually make amends for the pain his youthful ambition and later cowardice had caused. For Alara, the formal clearing of her name felt like setting down a weight she had carried for so long that its absence left her feeling almost unbalanced, as though she needed to relearn how to stand without its familiar burden pressing down upon her shoulders. She found herself, in the weeks following the council's decision, slowly allowing herself to imagine a future she had never dared consider during her years of solitary running. A life with roots, with community, with people who knew her fully, and had chosen to stand beside her regardless. Grace threw an impromptu celebration at the bakery once word of the council's decision spread through Ashfall Hollow, filling the small shop with warm bread, laughter, and genuine welcome that brought unexpected tears to Alara's eyes. Elias, ever perceptive despite his quiet nature, pulled her aside during the celebration to share a small, knowing smile. "Told you this town has a way of pulling secrets into the light," he said gently. "Glad yours turned out to be one worth celebrating rather than fearing." Nathan, who had been the first to learn her secret and had chosen trust over suspicion, became something close to a true friend in the weeks that followed, often checking in with genuine warmth, rather than the wary caution that had defined their earliest interactions. Vera, fully healed from her injuries, insisted on teaching Alara proper combat techniques to complement her returning wolf instincts, declaring with characteristic bluntness that anyone destined to become the alpha's mate needed to be able to hold her own in a fight. The bond between Alara and Cade deepened steadily during this time, no longer shadowed by the constant threat that had defined their earliest days together, allowed instead to grow naturally into something neither of them had quite dared hope for during those first uncertain encounters on the forest path. They spent long evenings together, sometimes talking late into the night about pasts they had both carried alone for too long, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. One crisp autumn evening, nearly 2 months after the council's ruling, Cade invited Alara to walk with him through the forest paths that had once filled her with such fear, now familiar and welcoming in the golden light of sunset. They walked in easy silence for a while, her wolf settled comfortably alongside his presence, until he finally stopped at a small clearing overlooking the valley below, where Ashfall Hollow's lights had just begun to flicker on against the deepening dusk. "I've been thinking," Cade said, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a rare vulnerability beneath its usual quiet confidence. "About bonds, and about homes, and about how strange it is that both found me on the very same night you first arrived at your cabin door." "Strange in a good way, I hope," Alara said, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the sudden nervous flutter in her chest at his tone. "In the best way," he confirmed, reaching for her hand. "Alara, I know your journey to trust, to believe you deserved good things again, hasn't been easy. I know accepting a bond, a mate, an entire pack and community, after years of believing you had to face everything alone, takes a kind of courage I deeply admire. But I want you to know, without any doubt, that whatever comes next, I intend to stand beside you, Exactly as fiercely as you stood beside me on that ridge. Wolf reclaimed, and heart fully open, ready to fight for something worth having. Tears gathered in her eyes, though this time they carried none of the old grief or fear that had defined so many nights before. I spent 4 years believing I would never truly belong anywhere again, she said softly, believing that love, that home, that safety, they were things meant for other people, not for someone carrying the kind of guilt I thought I deserved to carry. You didn't just help me clear my name, Cade. You helped me remember that I was worth defending in the first place. You always were, he said gently, cupping her face with the same tenderness he had shown that very first night the danger began. Your wolf simply needed the right reason to finally believe it too. As twilight settled fully over the valley below, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and gold, Cade drew her close, and this time, when their lips finally met, it felt not like the beginning of uncertain danger, but like the quiet, steady arrival of something long awaited. A promise made not under threat or fear, but freely, joyfully, between two people who had each found in the other exactly what their long, difficult journeys had been searching for all along. They returned to Ashfall Hollow together, as the first stars emerged overhead, walking not toward the small, isolated cabin, where fear had first found her door, but toward a future built on trust, freely given, and secrets finally, fully brought into the light. Behind them, the forest that had once seemed so full of danger, now stood quiet and peaceful, guardian rather than threat, home rather than hiding place. And ahead of them stretched a life neither had dared imagine possible, before the night a wolf, mighty and true, had finally found the door of the woman who had spent far too long believing she did not deserve to be found at all.